Before we get started with today's podcast episode, I just want to take a minute to share a little bit about Ballet BC's upcoming program Zenith, which is happening March 6th, 7th, and 8th in Vancouver at the Queen Elizabeth Theatre. Featuring a world premiere by local Canadian choreographer Andrea Penna, the return of the masterful work Passing from Johan Inger, and a new commission from Spanish choreographer Fernando Hernando Magadan, this program promises to be sensational. You can use code LET'SDANCE10 for 10% off your tickets, which are available now at balletbc.com. And don't worry, if you're not in Vancouver, the company is also touring this spring. They're going to be in Victoria, Toronto, London, Edinburgh, Germany, and a few other locations throughout the UK. So check out their website for all of those dates as well. And now, here's today's episode. Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Thank you so much for being here for part 2 of our competition series that I'm calling Competition Countdown. But like I said on the last episode, it is not necessarily a countdown, and a lot of you may have already entered into your competition season. Regardless of where you are in your competition cycle, all of the information in today's podcast and all the other ones in this little mini series are going to be totally relevant for you. So, with that being said, today I want to focus on what I'm calling competition first aid, but essentially, how do we deal with, or what do we need to know about if people are sustaining injuries during the competition season? And this podcast episode, kind of the inspiration behind it, was a little bit sparked by a conversation that was happening over on Threads, maybe last week, where somebody had posted and sort of said, hey, dance community, what do you think should be the requirements for first aid or medical professionals or medical staffing at dance competitions and battles and things like that? And overwhelmingly, the people commenting on that thread were in support of having that. So again, I often compare dance a bit to sport or reference my experience in the sport world, and specifically working as an on-field trainer in rugby for quite a few years and literally traveling with rugby teams and traveling to tournaments and all of that. And in most sporting events, and certainly when you get to like tournament structured events and things like that, there is medical coverage that is happening on site. And it is usually provided or organized, at least by the organizer of the tournament. So in our case, in the dance world, that would be medical coverage that is being organized by the competition owners or the competitions themselves. But for the most part, at least with my experience with the dance competition world, again, based in Vancouver, Canada, it is not the norm or commonplace to have any sort of first aid or medical professionals that are on site at these events. And personally, I feel like it should be a requirement. And I know every competition is going to run their events differently, but this just, again, kind of comes back to or circles back to the fact that there is no overarching governing body or organizational body within the dance industry that sanctions these types of things. So, with a few exceptions, so again, and we've talked about this a little bit on previous podcast episodes, because breaking became an Olympic event at the last Paris Olympics in 2024, there are some different sort of rules and requirements that were in place for that because, again, the IOC has control then over those events and structures and things like that. So from that perspective, there would have been events and potentially qualifying events for the Olympics and things like that, that would have had medical staff on site. And then certainly at the Olympics or major games or things like that, there is dedicated first aid and medical staff and emergency protocols and all of that type of stuff that goes on behind the scenes. Again, that's not mainstream or like commonplace within the dance industry, but there are certain sectors that may have that. I know other local dance competitions may have someone on staff who is trained in first aid. So that might be a requirement of one of their staff members or maybe like a group of their staff members. So they may have people on site who are trained in first aid, but that is not necessarily the role that they are hired for at the competition. So this could be, I'm just going to like pull out wild examples, but this could be like your MC or your stage manager or a front of house operations manager or something like that who also happens to be first aid trained. But generally, we do not see that there is dedicated medical staff on site at dance events. And I do feel that that is something that we will hopefully start to see change and can start to change the narrative on that. Because like I said, it is commonplace in youth sports, and certainly when you get to like higher levels and more elite levels of youth sports, that there is going to be dedicated medical staff. And in some cases, this is teams themselves who might have trainers, whether that be a physiotherapist or a team doctor or an athletic therapist, an athletic trainer, somebody like that who is dedicated to that team and travels with that team. That is one model that we see, and in some ways is maybe a preferable model because then that staff person or that person knows those athletes, knows their medical history. The athletes are comfortable with that person. They have access to them at ideally practices and stuff as well. But in some cases, I know I've done a little bit of work with minor hockey here, and a lot of those teams, they only have budget to pay for somebody like on game days. So they don't necessarily have somebody who's at every one of their practices, but they do have people who are there for competition. So on game days or at tournaments or things like that. So there's that model where individual teams, so in this case, it would be individual studios, would have a medical person who was, affiliated with that studio. But then, like I said, there's also this model where the organizers of an event, so in the case of a sports tournament, it would be the organizers of a tournament, would be the ones who would be responsible for having first aid or medical coverage on site. And this is a model that we see right now while I'm recording this. I'm recording a little bit early, but while I'm recording this, the Invictus Games are happening in Vancouver right now. And quite a few of my friends from the physio world are actually volunteering as medical staff for those games. So again, it's the organizers who put out a call to have people be on site to provide medical services for the athletes who are competing in those games. And so something similar is possible and would be ideal within the dance world, that you have an on-site medical person who is at a dance competition or a dance convention and is responsible for any type of emergency situations that would come up. I know there was a case, and this happens all the time, but I know there was a case recently in our area where there was a convention that was in town and a dancer got injured, and because the convention staff are not local necessarily, like they travel in from out of town, all of the teachers who are teaching, but even the organizers and all of the event staff are not familiar with the local area. So they were not well equipped to like help this dancer to know where the closest hospital was or like where the closest medical facilities were. And it was all just like a little bit chaotic. And I know from dancers who were at that event that it was a little bit kind of scary and traumatizing for some of those dancers to see this injury happen, but then not know like how to deal with it. And nobody really kind of knew what the emergency procedures for that were. So again, these are things that I think could be handled better in the dance world when we look at conventions or competitions or things like that, because unfortunately, injuries are going to happen. Injuries are an inevitable part of sports or dance or any time we're performing activities at a high elite level. So we need to be prepared to deal with those, and there should be qualified medical staff on site who can deal with emergency first aid situations
and also deal with a little bit of like injury triage. And so that's one of the things that I think is an advantage of having, whether it is a physio or an athletic trainer or somebody who has a little bit of a rehab background as well, who is your person who's providing the medical services on site, is they have the ability to assess injuries that have potentially happened, to triage severity and maybe say, okay, yes, this is realistic that you can probably dance again later today or dance again tomorrow, or no, this is an injury that requires further medical evaluation or, requires time off dance or things like that. So yes, we want people to have first aid experience, but in reality, the vast majority of injuries that are going to happen at a dance competition are not necessarily going to be life-threatening or emergency injuries. It is more often musculoskeletal type injuries that ideally we have somebody qualified who can do what we would in the sports physio world call on-field assessment, but in this case, it would be backstage assessment, to be able to say, like, yes, this is an injury that it's just like minor, this is what you're going to do for it, and you'll be good to go in 24 hours. Or no, this is definitely something that you cannot continue to dance on or continue to compete on. Because the way it stands right now, it's pretty much entirely up to the dancer and or the parent to try and make that call. And they don't necessarily have any medical knowledge or even know what the injury is or what's going on. And they are then also relying on their teachers to try and help them make that call. And teachers, although amazing at what they do in teaching, are not trained medical professionals, and they should also not be trying to determine severity of injuries and decide whether dancers can or cannot keep dancing. And so it makes it really tricky when you have an event that's happening and you have to make this call about whether a dancer can or cannot participate. And oftentimes what we see is dancers end up going on stage when they probably should not have, because they just haven't had any support to be able to make that decision, and they feel like they're letting their team down, and obviously they don't want to miss out on it, and all of those things that factor into it. And so having somebody on staff who is a trained medical professional who can have some input into that conversation takes some of the guesswork out of that for studios and dancers and parents and everybody else who is involved. So just a little bit of food for thought, because like I said, it was an interesting conversation that came up on Threads. Overwhelmingly, it sounded like, people really felt like dance events should be treated similarly to sporting events, and there should be medical support on site for these events. And it does sound like in certain circles, and especially kind of the breaking world and certain battles that are happening, that is becoming more of the norm. And like I said, I suspect that is because of some of the regulations that were in place for Olympic qualification and stuff like that. So something to think about, especially if you are a competition or convention owner or are in contact with those types of people. Definitely something you want to consider in terms of whether you have any sort of on-site medical services available. Now, I also want to cover in this podcast topic what we do or what we want to do if a dancer does have an injury. So in the past, there was an acronym that was used really commonly for injuries in not just the sports world, but just in general. So in the first aid world, if you've ever taken any basic first aid courses or things like that, and that was the RICE, or I think it started as like the ICE acronym, but that evolved into RICE, or at some point evolved into PRICE as well. And so that RICE protocol stood for rest, ice, compression, and elevation. And that's been around for years and years and years and years. However, it is not the most current evidence for what we actually want to do in the case of an injury. So that acronym has actually been replaced by a different acronym that has been around for a few years now, but is still kind of slowly gaining traction in first aid and kind of sports injury settings. And that acronym is peace and love. And I've actually done an entire podcast episode on this topic So if you want to hear like more specifically about this, feel free to go check out episode 16 where I talk about dance first aid. But I am going to recap it because I think it's really important going into the competition season or in the competition season for us to remember this peace and love acronym. And there are a bunch of reasons why this acronym has replaced the RICE acronym. And part of it is just evolving evidence in terms of injury healing and recovery and what we know in terms of the processes involved and how the body heals and how we can optimize healing. But the other thing that I love about this new acronym, and one of the reasons why it has been really widely accepted within the medical community, is because it accounts for the acute phase of an injury, so an injury that just like has happened really recently, and then also gives direction as to how to move forward into the subacute or the more chronic phase of an injury, or so further on down that healing timeline. Whereas previously, that RICE acronym was very much only really applicable to acute injuries. And so one of the problems with it is that people would just continue to follow that rest, ice, compress, and elevate for much, much longer than they needed to because there was nothing to progress into or no direction as to where to go once that acute phase was over. So with the peace and love acronym, peace is, and it's PEACE, like peace and love, the peace part of it is the acute phase of an injury, whereas the love part is the more subacute or sort of like longer term recovery part of that injury. So I'm going to go through what the letters stand for and how these can apply to our dancers, especially in sort of a competition setting. So the P stands for protection. And so that can look like a lot of different things. That might be using a brace or a splint, or even casting an area if there's a fracture or something. It could be the use of crutches or a cane. It can be limiting weight bearing. It can be modifying activities so as not to leave the injured area vulnerable to repeated injury. Anything like that falls into that category of protection. So we want to protect the injured area first and foremost so that it does not get injured any further. The E still stands for elevation. So elevation is still something we want to consider in terms of blood flow and lymphatic drainage and inflammation and all of those types of things. So protection, elevation. The A stands for avoiding anti-inflammatories. And this is a really important one because again, in the old RICE protocol, there was nothing that talked about any types of like medication or anything like that. But there was, I think a lot of people would reach for an anti-inflammatory. And there was this idea that, okay, we've had this injury, there's swelling, there's inflammation, we're going to, take an anti-inflammatory immediately and try and decrease that inflammation. And in reality, what we know is that the inflammatory process is necessary for tissue healing to occur. It is the first step in tissue healing is the inflammatory process that signals to the body to kickstart that healing process. It brings certain cells to the area that start that tissue healing process. And if we are taking anti-inflammatory medications, especially in that really acute phase, we can disrupt that signaling pathway that is really necessary for proper tissue healing to occur when we have had an injury. So we want to try and avoid anti-inflammatories, especially during that acute phase, as much as possible. It is still perfectly reasonable to be taking pain medications if that is necessary, depending on like pain levels and things like that. But if we are looking at pain medications, we want to be taking pain medications that are not anti-inflammatory pain medications. So if you're not sure what the difference is, certainly talk to a pharmacist at your local pharmacy. I know different medications have different names in different countries, but just as a very broad example for people in North America, an example of a pain medication that is not an anti-inflammatory would be acetaminophen or Tylenol as a brand name. I know in the UK it's called paracetamol. So again, naming is a little bit different depending on where you are in the world, but certainly talk to a pharmacist and find out what pain medication or pain control options you have that are not anti-inflammatory in terms of the mechanism that they work by. So that is A, is avoiding anti-inflammatory. So we have protection, elevation, avoiding anti-inflammatories. C still stands for compression. So we still want to consider compression of the area, and that could be a compression garment. It could be a tensor bandage, all sorts of different options for compression. And then the E stands for evaluation, and that is ideally an evaluation by a trained medical professional. And so this comes back to what we were just talking about with having trained medical professionals on site at dance competitions. So ideally, if somebody had an injury that they sustained at a competition, they would be able to have that evaluated right away on site by a trained medical professional who can then give them more information about the severity of the injury, what exactly the injury is, all of those types of things. So that is the acute phase of our injury. We want to protect the injury, elevate, compress, avoid our anti-inflammatories, and have it evaluated by a trained professional. And I will say, depending on the nature of the injury, who you get that injury evaluated by is probably going to vary. Again, if we suspect a really serious injury, then potentially that dancer is going to be going to an emergency room and being seen by a physician or things like that. But most injuries that happen in dancers are not significant or serious in nature. Most of them are mild to moderate in nature, and most of them are musculoskeletal. So they could be evaluated by a physical therapist or an athletic therapist or, a chiropractor or whoever it is who is on site who is trained to be evaluating those types of injuries. So depending on the type of injury and how severe we think it is, that evaluation is going to be done by different people. Then moving into the more kind of subacute and chronic phase of injury recovery. And when I say chronic, I'm not talking about a chronic injury that's taking years to recover. I'm just talking about as an injury moves through the healing process, those are what we call the phases. So this could be happening, 2 weeks after the initial injury. I'm not talking about months or years down the road necessarily, although this also applies to those types of injuries as well. So then we have our LOVE acronym. And so LOVE, the L stands for load. We want to load the injury as much as is tolerated. So controlled loading of the area. We know that if we completely unload an area, whether that be through crutches or a walking boot or casting or things like that, we have a lot of other secondary complications that occur in terms of immobility and losing muscle mass and things like that. So we want to load within tolerance as much as we can. The O stands for optimism. There is a massive, massive link between our sort of mental health and our physical health, which I'm sure most people are aware of. But there is a lot of research that shows that people who are more optimistic about their injury outcome actually have faster recoveries. So whether that is just sort of their outlook of being okay, I've got this is a temporary setback. Maybe I'm going to miss one competition, but not spiraling into, am I ever going to dance again? And sort of those more sinister thoughts. And again, this is much, much easier said than done. Injuries can be very impactful on dancers and can have a really big toll on their mental health. But we do want to support that side of things because we do have faster injury recoveries when people are more optimistic and in a better mental health headspace. And so that also may look like seeking out supports and resources in that area to facilitate your recovery. So not just seeking out physical rehabilitation, so whether that's physiotherapy or whatever, but it may also mean working with a psychologist or a counselor or somebody else to address that part of injury recovery as well. The V stands for vascularization. So we want blood flow to go to the injured area to help support healing and speed up healing and all of those good things. And so that can look like various forms of cardiovascular exercise or just range of movement exercises that are getting movement and blood flow going to that injured area. Again, we know that immobilization is bad for injury healing. It delays injury healing. We want to keep things moving and as active as we can. And then the E stands for exercise. And that is, going to be injury dependent, whether it is looking at more loading strategy, so more strength, more endurance, whether it's cardiovascular fitness, whether it's like muscle flexibility or joint mobility or whatever that looks like, which is going to be injury specific, but it is the exercise part of injury healing for the kind of more subacute and chronic phase of injury recovery. So again, love, load, optimism, vascularization, and exercise. You can see that all of those are pretty movement heavy. So again, we want to be going about it in a smart way and controlling our movements and loading things progressively. But that loading and that movement is really important for injury recovery. Whereas previously with that RICE protocol, it didn't talk about any of those things, and people would just kind of get stuck in this cycle of resting, icing, compressing, and elevating, and then wondering why their injury was taking a really long time to recover or wasn't recovering as quickly as they would have liked it to. So that's just a quick little rundown of the Peace and Love acronym. Like I said, there's an entire podcast episode that dives a bit more deeply into some of that stuff if you're interested in kind of the history of some of that stuff or a little bit more of like the research behind some of it. That is episode 16. I will link it in the show notes, and it's, I believe, just called Dancer First Aid, but I will put that in the show notes for you. So, like I said, if we do have an injury that occurs during competition season or at a competition, the first thing we should be thinking about, or the first thing that should pop into our head, is peace and love, and then following those acronyms. The last thing I want to touch on for today's podcast episode is, how do we know if a dancer can or cannot perform or compete in a competition? And there are so many factors that play into this. And so this really is, like I said, a decision that should be made in conjunction with a medical professional, because there's just so much stuff that surrounds that. And my answer or my advice is not always going to be exactly the same given the scenario and the dancer and things like that. But we do have some like minimum requirements and standards that we want to be looking at. So it is not uncommon that dancers will come into the clinic with a fairly fresh acute injury where they still have, a lot of active swelling and inflammation and really reduced joint range of motion, and they can't fully weight bear on that side of their body or things like that. And then they'll ask me, can I compete this weekend? And generally, well, I shouldn't even say generally, the answer in those instances is going to be no. So when we have an injury that is still in that like acute phase and you are lacking range of motion and, strength and all of that type of thing, the risk for further injury or, subsequent injuries in other areas of the body that are compensating or things like that are just too high to make it worthwhile. The injuries that are a little bit trickier, or the ones that sometimes have a little bit more nuance in terms of like, can a dancer compete or can a dancer not compete, are injuries that are, on their way to healing and they have full range of motion and maybe their strength is coming along and it's pretty good. Maybe it's not 100%, but it's pretty good, but they still have pain with certain movements. And in those instances, that is a little bit more of a gray area. And things that we take into consideration are things like, how many more competitions do you have in the season? Is this the first one? And are we going to risk further injury and then missing the entire rest of the season? Or is this your very last competition ever? You're, a senior, you're graduating, you're going off to college, you're auditioning for companies or whatever, and this is your last chance to compete with this team. Those are two very different scenarios where my advice and our decisions about whether it is appropriate for a dancer to compete or not are going to be different in those scenarios. So it's not always super, super black and white, but there are definitely some guidelines that we want to be following in terms of what it is that dancers are participating in. And so depending on what the injury is, there's certain criteria that we're going to ask dancers to be able to like perform or be able to show us that they're able to do. And so, you know, if it was, say, an ankle sprain type injury, is a dancer able to perform a minimum number and probably at least 16, if not closer to 20 or 24, single leg rises on that affected side? Do they have the strength to be able to do that? Are they able to perform at least 16 single leg sautés on that injured side? If they can do things like that, then the risk for them going out and competing, and especially when the dances are only, 2.5 to 3 minutes long or however long a dance is, the risks are going to be lower than if a dancer isn't meeting those functional criteria. And again, what we are asking the dancers to perform functionally is going to be really, really dependent on what their injury is. But this is why it is so important for dancers to ideally be cleared or at least assessed by a medical professional so that you know exactly what the criteria are for your particular injury or your particular body, because it's not super black and white. We can't just say, oh, you sprained your ankle 2 weeks ago. Okay, you're fine to compete now. It should be healed. That is really time does not give us any sort of an adequate indication as to where a dancer is. We could have a dancer who injured their ankle a week ago who is totally fine to perform and compete, like they've recovered, it was minor, whatever. And we can have somebody who had an injury 8 weeks ago who's still far away from being at that point. So time is really not a good indicator and is often, I think, an indicator that teachers and dancers try and use where they think, okay, I injured myself, my next competition's in 2 weeks, I should be fine by then. But really, we want to look at functionally, what is the dancer able to do? What are they able to perform? Are they able to go out there and safely participate in that competition without risking further injury or other subsequent injuries? So again, there's a lot of information and definitely a topic I could go into in a lot more depth and detail, but my whole point of bringing it up in today's podcast episode was to hopefully just hammer home the point about seeking out a proper evaluation and proper medical care if you have sustained an injury and you do have competitions and things like that coming up. And the earlier you can, do that and not wait until the day before a competition, the better it's going to be, because chances are that medical professional, whether it be physio, chiro, whatever, is going to be able to give you some things to work on to get you to the point where you will hopefully be able to take the stage. And so if you are dealing with injuries or pain or things like that, we really want to try and seek out evaluation as quickly as possible so that you have a really good idea of what those expectations can be moving forwards. And then also, if the reality is that you're not going to be able to participate in an upcoming competition, your studio and your teachers really want to know that as far ahead as possible so they can potentially fill your spot with an understudy or reblock a dance or do whatever it is that they need to do so that everybody else in your team is comfortable with you potentially being absent if there has been an injury. So again, huge, big topic I could go on for ages and ages about, but I just want you to consider that if we do have an injury that happens during competition season or happens out of dance competition, we want to follow that peace and love protocol, and that the final E in the peace part of it is getting that injury evaluated or assessed by a medical professional so that we have a really good, clear indication of what is reasonable or not reasonable in terms of participating in upcoming competitions. So hopefully that episode was helpful for you and maybe gave you a little bit of food for thought in terms of whether we do or do not have first aid and medical support and things like that at dance competitions, and why that might be, and whether that is something that should be changing in the future. Should we be seeing all of our competitions and conventions that our dancers are attending having dedicated medical staff on site? My personal opinion is that yes, we absolutely should be having that happening, but would love to hear your thoughts on that, why that is maybe does or does not occur within the dance world. Feel free to reach out, send me an email, send me a message. I would love to have a discussion about that. And once again, thank you so much for listening. Stay tuned for next week for part 3 of the competition countdown series, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.